So the next 3 decades will determine the future of humanity. 10,000 years ago, we started a completely unprecedented experiment, which was the domestication of nature for the service of a single species. Well, 9,000 and something years later, that really took off. And in the last 2 centuries, our species has come to completely dominate the planet. And in this next period, as we approach a full planet, and the human population is no longer growing exponentially, it's leveling off, we're going into this period of transition. And the big question is, will we achieve that gracefully, or will we overshoot and crash and burn? The 2 things which determine that are, firstly, are we going to moderate the demands that we put on the capacity of the Earth to within its ability to deliver? And the second is, are we able to keep that capacity to provide the things that we need to sustain life, or are we going to degrade it? So, I'm a systems ecologist. That's an ecologist who studies ecosystems. A number of years ago, a big national newspaper here in Johannesburg introduced me as an assistant ecologist. So you might like to wait until the main man shows up and tells you what's really going on. But most recently, I co-led the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, land degradation and restoration assessment. Around the world, 300 scientists, 3 years. The numbers that come out of that are actually both amazing and a bit depressing. Only about 20% of the world still functions in its natural state. Another 20% of the world, another fifth, has been completely transformed to serve us. In other words, this is our croplands, this is our plantation forests, this is our cities and our infrastructure. The bit in between, the sort of 3/5, are highly modified by what we do. These are our rangelands, our managed forests, and of this totality, about 15% of the world as we speak is actually quite severely degraded. We, as a species, are now appropriating about 1/3 of the net primary production of the world. That's like nature's GDP. So 1/3 of that is coming to us. The consequence of these transformations has been enormous impact on the ecosystems of the world, on the forests, on the rivers, on the oceans, on all of those things on which we depend. And for 3 out of 5 people living in the world right now, this is the most pressing environmental issue. Okay? It's not about climate change, it's not about this, it's not about that. It's the fact that we have actually damaged the ability of ecosystems to support us. And the cost of that to the global economy is largely invisible because it's not counted in things like the GDP. But that impact is around about 10% of all global wealth. When we look at South Africa, the numbers, if anything, are slightly more stark. But in South Africa, we carry an additional historical burden. And that is, of course, that when Europeans came here some several hundred years ago, they displaced Bantu-speaking people who were already occupying the land. As those Bantu-speaking people had displaced Khoi and San people before them. And as a young democracy, we are committed to the idea of making access to the land and its resources much more equitable than it currently is. But at the same time, we understand that what we get from the land isn't just stuff, okay? It's not just what crops can we grow, what water can we harvest. It's also that nature has values for nature itself. In other words, nature is also there to support the other 10 million species who occupy this planet. And finally, nature is an deep, deep part of our self-identity. So it's not just about material goods, it's around about our relationship to ourselves and to the land. And as we go through this process of land reform in South Africa, we're at a moment of huge opportunity. We're also at a moment of enormous risk. You can learn a lot from looking at an image of South Africa taken from space. The first thing you will notice is that you can see degradation of the land from 800 kilometers up. You can see it from space. It's those bright areas you can see on the land. Those are degraded. The second thing to notice is that they're not randomly distributed in the landscape. They're clustered. And some of that clustering is because of natural reasons. There are particular soils, particular climates which are more susceptible to degradation than others. But some of those clusters bear the human imprint. They show, for instance, political boundaries. Nature didn't create those, we created those. And one of the stark ones in the context of South Africa is you can very clearly see the imprint of former policies. You can see the impact of the 1913 and 1936 Land Acts, which were the acts which confined black people to living on only a certain fraction of the land, and degradation was the result of that. Just as in space, degradation is not distributed generally over the landscape, so in time, degradation typically occurs at distinct moments. It occurred, for instance, during our major droughts. We see a big increase in land degradation. And that often also ties to moments in which we altered policy. And so the message for this is that we have agency here. We as humans alter the way that the land performs. And in particularly, the future of the land is not independent of the rules that we establish around how it is used. So, at this moment of land reform in South Africa, its history over the last 20-odd years should caution us against looking at it in a very narrow political and legal sense only. We like to frame this discussion as a story about villains and victims. But in fact, the reality is a lot more nuanced than that. There are at least as many heroes as there are villains. For instance, I have an interest in botanical diversity, in the richness of plant life, and we have a fabulously rich country. And I noticed, looking at the maps of richness of South Africa, there was one hotspot, a giant peak of richness in a place that I know quite well. And so I tried to investigate what was going on there. Why has this never been described before? And it turns out to be the farm of a man who had lived there his entire life. He was born on that farm. His parents had owned it before me. He lived his entire life on this farm. He, in between raising sheep and cattle, was passionate about botany, and he went out and he collected all the plants there and he described them and made lists. And that's why there's this enormous peak of biodiversity on that little farm. Okay, it's because of one man being interested in it. I call it the Claes Devenish effect. And the important thing is that the way we relate to the land, okay, is up to us as individuals and our individual perception of that land. The history of land reform in recent decades tells us that most of those enterprises have resulted in a decrease in agricultural productivity and an increase in poverty of the very people that they were supposed to benefit. So how do we turn that story around? One of the causes to this is a change in the relationship that we bear to the land. What Aldo Leopold, nearly a century ago, referred to as the land ethic. In other words, how do we see our responsibilities towards the land? Do we see it simply as a set of rights, of exploitation rights, that we as owners of that land have an unrestricted license to take everything from that land to our own benefit? Or do we see it in terms of a responsibility to the broader society and to future generations? So you can think of this evolution of a land ethic more or less as a kind of Ubuntu towards the land. So we seem to be between an immovable object, which is the finite size of South Africa, and an irresistible force, which is the insatiable hunger for everyone to have a slice of it. The discourse around land in South Africa has two completely separate narratives. The first is social policy towards the land. In other words, who owns the land, who occupies the land, and that is a whole set of processes that underlie it. We also have an environmental discourse about the land, about what is the condition of the land, around protection and restoration. And thus far, those two things have been completely separate. So here is my transformational proposal. Why don't we make those one and the same thing? Why don't we unify those two big threads in our discussion about how the land should be in the future of South Africa and make them one and the same thing? With this goal, to sustain and restore the life-supporting capacity of the land for the benefit of everyone. So we know that our activities thus far have mostly resulted in a loss of value in that land. And so in a situation of a tight fiscus and no money to go around and lots of demands, it's really, really hard to justify that we should spend more of that taxpayers' money in fact, destroying value. But if we take a much broader view of the land, see the land not only as this asset, this financial asset, but it's also something on which we build our culture and our identity and our social capital, and it's also something which delivers value to us through natural capital. Then if we can grow those social capitals and grow those natural capitals, it's no longer a zero-sum game of transferring wealth from one person to another. Then we're in fact growing our total wealth, and that investment, that social investment, whether it comes from the public purse or from the private purse, actually is an investment and not a loss. How would this actually work in practice? Well, there are some precedents. During the height of the Great Depression around the world in the 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt had this idea of using the power of the state to employ the unemployed, the desperate unemployed, in conservation works, to work on especially, maintaining and building the natural capital in the United States of America. Remember, this is at the end of the Great Dust Bowl era. They were facing serious environmental problems. And the legacy of that is with us today. 100 years nearly later, we still see not only the physical legacy of that investment, but also the psychological legacy that one of the legacies that left was something that was implemented here in South Africa. So one of the, I think, great proud achievements of our post-94 democracy is the programs that we have of poverty relief through building natural capital. This is the Working for Water program, the Working on Fire program, the Working on Wetlands program, the Working on Coast program. And what those programs do is they use money which is destined to relieve poverty amongst the most disadvantaged people by providing short-term jobs which give them both skills and dignity, and at the same time are rebuilding natural capital in the country. And what I'm proposing is essentially just a logical extension of that, okay, and coupling it to the land reform process. So, for instance, one way you can do it is you can make sure that the transfer price, when former owners are replaced with new owners, incorporates what's the value of the natural capital. In other words, if someone degraded their land before it was transferred, that comes out of the purchase price, okay? And so it takes away the incentive to do so. Similarly, if a person had invested in the land through sound stewardship and it was in an excellent condition, that should also be reflected in the price. Let's take a moment to imagine South Africa in 2050 if we did this kind of change in mindset that I'm proposing. Firstly, by that stage, 80% of South Africa will be living in cities. And that alone takes a great deal of pressure off the land. But the cities that they live in are not the slums and the dysfunctional situation that we have in 2019. Most people are living in neighborhoods in which they both sleep and work and go to school and play, all within walking distance. And those village-sized neighborhoods are loosely connected into metropoles through transport corridors and other infrastructural structures. Those neighborhoods produce a lot of their own electrical power through wind and solar energy. They process most of their wastes and they harvest most of their own water. They also grow a significant fraction of their own food on rooftops, in gardens, in allotments. And many of the people who are in those cities are also engaged very directly in the management of nature. In the countryside, on the other hand, there's been enormous changes imposed on us by climate change. And most of the arid interior of South Africa, 80% of the country, is now impossible to do crop agriculture or livestock agriculture. As a result, it has gone back to being migratory wildlife systems. And far from being a non-contributor to our economy, the main economic benefits that come out of that are wild harvested animals, the replacement for the feedlot-fed animals that we currently consume, and ecotourism. And in a world that is full everywhere, those two products are the highest value products that we can generate off the land. The remaining parts of the country where we are still able to do agriculture in the cropping sense are managed intensively, because the footprint is really quite small, the available land is quite small, but extremely carefully. And the mountainous areas are now completely set aside for the generation of water, because that is going to be our major constraint going into the future. Fortunately, that also coexists very happily with recreational use. And almost everyone, even those who live in cities, have a completely new relationship to nature. People have much more of a relationship to nature than they even had in the past, because much of our menial work is now done by machines. So what do people spend their time on? They spend their time on building relationships in their community and building relationships with nature through the little patch that they're growing in the cities, or through being volunteers in natural areas, or through being professionals managing the landscape. So by that stage, the world will have to have achieved this transition. It will have to have gone, the countries which are on the bottom limb of that graph, where the people are below the level of human achievement that we desire of them, will have to have moved up onto the right-hand side of the graph. But they must do so not on the trajectory which we followed in the past, which takes us into developed but completely unsustainable. We need to collectively move into that bottom right-hand quadrant. Now for South Africa, and that's its current position, that's not that far to go. We can achieve that. We can achieve both the level of social development which we desire, but we can do it in a way which allows us to persist on this planet into the future. So I hope to live long enough to see that future. But after a lifetime spent in the abstractions of research and the generalities of global policy, I'm now focusing much more of my attention on a particular finite little area of the planet. These are the Afro-montane ecosystems of South Africa, the high mountain ecosystems of South Africa. In the words of Alan Paton in Cry the Beloved Country, more lovely than the singing of it. And so this is the small town of Wakkerstroom in Mpumalanga, where my wife, who's in the audience here, and myself have built a cottage which has got the smallest possible ecological footprint that we could manage. It's off the grid, it does all marvelous sort of things, it's a very lovely place to live. And we spend our time, increasingly, in this location trying to first gain knowledge about the ecosystems in that area and bring the community along in how we can use them sustainably and effectively in the long term. So, the final thought that I will leave you with is that I challenge you individually to adopt some patch of land somewhere, big or small, that you care about deeply, and become custodians of it in the future. The critical thing is you don't have to own it to love it.